This is the CitizenLink Report.
If you find our insights helpful, would you support our video efforts? Your gift of $25 or more goes a long ways. Covers the crew, lights, cameras, all that. Just click on Donate. Thanks from all of us.
One activist says the proper response to public prayer is to boo and go. This is the CitizenLink Report. Hi, I'm Stuart Shepard along with Bruce Hausknecht, who follows the courts for Focus on the Family. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Stuart.
Let's talk about this. By now, we've all heard about the Supreme Court ruling that strongly affirmed prayer at government meetings. At least one activist is suggesting some ways to respond to that. This is from a letter that was posted on the Freedom from Religion Foundation website. He writes, if members of the public are allowed to voice approval in any way, for example, by answering amen after a prayer or by applauding or cheering after invocations, the public must be allowed, he writes, to voice disapproval, for example, by booing, making a thumbs down gesture, blowing a raspberry, or by making other audible sounds signifying disapproval. One can only wonder. And he goes on to write, if the government continues to insult atheists and or religious minorities with sectarian prayers, I didn't realize prayers were an insult. I thought that was the diversity he's asking for. Sorry, I'm giving commentary. If the government continues to insult atheists and or religious minorities with sectarian prayers, activists may turn to public mockery and ridicule. And he goes on, Bruce, to describe perhaps an anti-prayer hat with big earmuffs and dark sunglasses and a little video camera on top to get the reaction of anybody. I think that would bring ridicule, but perhaps not in the direction he was somewhat humorously suggesting there. That all sounds like a party waiting to happen.
I hope he's not serious, because that would be the antithesis of the occasion before a legislative body that wants to begin by focusing on the gravity of the situation, invoking the Lord's presence, or whatever deity of whoever is praying. That just strikes me as un-American.
Well, and is it proper to boo a prayer at a public meeting? Is he correct that that should be legally allowed?
No, that seems to be the modus operandi, if you will, of the left these days, at any kind of free speech or any kind of message that they don't like, whether it's the college campus or now apparently before the solemn proceedings of a legislature or city council.
Well, and one would suspect that this is not the British Parliament. In the U.S. form of government, we are expected to show at least a modicum of respect for the person speaking. Hence, booing and making other noises probably not the proper way to go about that.
No. We're talking about a practice of solemnizing a legislative body that goes back to the 1770s.
Yeah, let's talk about the history of this whole thing and the practical application of what the Supreme Court said is good and proper under the U.S. Constitution. At first, they called this legislative prayer. So they're saying this is a particular time and place. What does that mean, legislative prayer? When and where and all that?
In our history as Americans, we have begun legislatures, Congress, state legislatures. We've begun those sessions with prayer. It goes back to probably before this, but there's the recorded instance that we have goes back to Sam Adams in the 1774 session of the First Continental Congress. It was reignited again at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when Ben Franklin asked the group to begin each day with prayer as they formulated the document that would ground our whole government. And it's happened on a nonstop basis ever since.
And it also tends to separate out by calling it legislative prayer that this is proper before a body where they're discussing ideas and going to vote on it, as opposed to, say, a court or a judge leading a prayer before he's about to decide if you're going to jail or not.
That's right. It's supposed to focus the lawmakers on the gravity of the situation, the importance of what they're doing for their public, for their citizens, and to get them thinking in terms of universal values that are shared by the entire community as they legislate.
Now, it was interesting to me as I read through the decision by the Supreme Court, they kept citing a previous decision where they'd already decided on this. What was that, and why did this come back?
Yeah, this is not a new issue. In 1983, the Supreme Court heard a case called Chambers v. Marsh, and it's usually called Marsh. Had to do with the legislature in Nebraska beginning its legislative sessions with prayer. The Supreme Court said that's fine. It's a tradition. It's perfectly fine with the First Amendment. The people who drafted the First Amendment hired the first chaplains to begin sessions of Congress with prayer. So nothing wrong with that. And they approved it in most instances. They said, but please don't proselytize or denigrate someone else's faith or have an improper motive in doing so. That's the only caveats that they put on this.
So they set some broad guidelines, but did not want to get into the specifics of what's in the prayer.
Well, exactly, because once you have anybody in government parsing out what's proper prayer or not, you are violating the Establishment Clause. You are forcing government to impose its own version of religion on the population.
It was interesting to me in the decision that just came out, the most current one, that Justice Kennedy made clear as he wrote it, that if one prayer wanders off, if this is a series of prayers at multiple sessions, and one of them breaks the guidelines that they've set, that doesn't blow up the whole program. That's just an anomaly.
Yeah, and he's looking for, the majority of the court in the Town of Greece decision is looking for a pattern that really shows an improper motive. You have to expect that on any given day, someone might run off the rails and say something they shouldn't. But that's the way our democracy works. It's organic, and people are going to make mistakes, but we don't punish them for individual mistakes.
And the idea of having more speech instead of less. Now, if they already ruled on this, why come back to it? Why was this case even brought all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Well, the Marsh case was also the subject in 1989 of another an aside in another opinion having to do with a nativity scene in a town hall. It was kind of a First Amendment Establishment Clause kind of case. And as a throwaway line, the liberal majority in that case said, well, you know, the only reason the prayers that were approved in Marsh under the Establishment Clause are okay are because they were really not prayed to any sectarian god. You know, it was a generic god. And since 1989, we've been laboring under that misapprehension of what the court said there. This case, Town of Greece, clears up that problem and said, listen, Marsh always stood for the proposition that religious prayers, sectarian prayers, are fine in a legislative context.
And as you're pointing out, not only did they revisit it, they said, no, seriously, this is what we mean. They made a stronger decision.
Yes, they did. They said, no, sectarian prayers are not required. In fact, to require sectarian prayer would violate the First Amendment. And it has put this kind of out of reach of further debate.
Let's talk about the application of this. What does it mean for my local school board meeting, my local city council meeting? What's in, what's out, what's okay, what's accepted?
Yes. The first one is it happens before the meeting, at the very front end of the meeting. It's not in the middle. You're not praying over various items of policy. You're beginning the session with prayer. The next thing is it has to be non-discriminatory. If you are going as a legislative body, if you're going to invite people, chaplains to come and pray or people of faith to come and pray, make it non-discriminatory. Get as many people involved or as many faith groups as possible so that you are not singling out one group as the majority or not. That's what Town of Greece did. They tried to look through the directory of the town and asked all the churches to please come volunteer. The problem in that case was that town is primarily 90-something% Christian.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court went on to say you don't have to go outside your local community. You don't have to bus in, if you will, people from other faiths in order to achieve some kind of equality.
Yes, you'd think that would be obvious, but the court had to say it.
Now, let's talk about the self-described atheist and humanist groups. This is the label they put on themselves, who are up in arms about this. What is the larger issue here? Do they have a point?
You know, I think there are two issues here. One is there is a struggle in the public square that I would say a militant atheism has arisen in this country that really is trying to scrub all prayer out of the public square. That has really come of age in the last decade or so. So there is that issue. But in some cases, they have a point about this isn't a license to begin Christian prayers only in every legislature and every city council in the United States. There are still parameters and rules that they're worried about that are legitimate concerns.
Now, it's interesting that the word diversity came up in that letter I was quoting earlier, because it would seem like diversity would include bringing in all different points of view, which the Supreme Court affirmed, but somehow the definition of diversity is, as long as you're like all of us, you're being diverse, but if you're being like you, you're not. Well,
Yeah, that is a problem, and it goes back to this non-sectarian. It's all religions are equal, I guess.
Now, there was a recent decision by the highest court of Massachusetts which dealt with the Pledge of Allegiance and under God. What's the connection here? How do these two work together?
Another of these cases, these Pledge of Allegiance challenges come up routinely in several states every couple of years. Massachusetts highest court recently said, no, saying under God in the pledge is perfectly constitutional, and importantly for both cases here, just because you're offended because there's a voluntary act going on of the pledge or a prayer, that does not give you a violation of the Constitution that you can run to court with.
And the key there, as I remember, was just because you're offended doesn't mean you're being coerced into doing something.
That's right. That's the good thing about the Greece decision is they emphasize, are you being coerced as opposed to being offended? And the difference in the violation hinges on coercion, not being offended.
Now, this is already having some impact on other courts around the country. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's one pending case in Maryland where within hours after the Greece decision, this court that had stopped a city council from praying in Jesus' name, he lifted his injunction, took it away, and said it's because the Supreme Court has ruled.
Yeah, you think he would have looked at that older case, but we're glad he looked at the most recent one.
Exactly.
Bruce, thanks for your input. Very helpful today.
Thank you, Stuart.
And we encourage you to encourage prayer at your local city council, town council, school board, whatever it might be, a deliberative body in the sense of a legislative body. Encourage them to have a prayer. If they don't, the Supreme Court explains how and when it's okay. And we should take advantage of that freedom that they've now reestablished for us under the Constitution. And we encourage you to pray for our elected officials as they make those decisions at the local level. Pray for your local school board, for your local city council, for your local county commissioners, whatever it might be. If you can find a list of their names, pray for them by name. These are people who need your support in prayer as they do the work that they do. And remember, stand tall and be heard.